saw God. It was green, in the eyepiece of N/PVS 4 night vision scope, 14 feet tall, with horns that breathed. October 19th, 1987, 2:40 a.m. Northern edge of the Waco Range, 17 miles north of the Texas-New Mexico border, Camp McGregor, temporary staging site of Bravo Company, 2nd Reconnaissance Battalion, 3rd Brigade, 10th Mountain Division. The moon wasn't particularly bright that night, but it was enough to see the barbed wire 50 yards out without night vision. The air smelled like sagebrush and diesel generators, mixed together like some cheap cleaning solution. My knuckles had started to stiffen from gripping the handguard of my M16 for too long. Not from cold, though desert nights did drop to around 40 degrees Fahrenheit, but that stiffness had nothing to do with temperature. It was the result of certain muscles contracting on their own before your brain has registered why. Back then I didn't know that. I just thought I was tired. That afternoon we had just finished a 3-day rear area patrol across the dry bed of the Great Salt Lake. Our boots were filled with alkaline dust, and everyone had blisters bleeding at the ankles. After returning to camp, Duty Officer Lieutenant Jasper Kovac told us during the briefing that we were on silent standby for the next 48 hours, awaiting further movement orders. As he spoke, his fingers kept rubbing the pale white ring on his left ring finger where his wedding band used to be. I later learned from others that his wife's divorce papers had arrived at the camp that morning via military mail. That's the military. A man being told his 10-year marriage is over, then calmly assigning night watch rotations. Lieutenant Kovac's eyes swept across us, tired and unfocused under the kerosene lamp shadows. He assigned the posts. Private First Class Michael Sanchez and I were assigned to Observation Post OP-7 at the southeast perimeter, from 0200 to 0600. Sanchez was from El Paso, spoke Spanish almost indistinguishable from locals, dark-skinned, with a wide white smile. The two of us crouched inside a half-ring sandbag position, NN/PVS 4 night vision scope mounted in front of us, wired to a lead-acid battery pack below. The image in that scope was a grainy green field, any heat source turned into a glowing green outline like some surreal etching. Nothing happened for the first 3 hours. Occasionally a kangaroo rat would dart through the brush at night, leaving faint thermal traces. Sanchez talked in a low voice about things his older brother had seen on border patrol in El Paso. Mexican cartel tunnels in the desert, a whole pickup truck of people vanishing on Interstate 10. I wasn't really listening. I'd heard it more than 20 times before. He told the same stories every shift, like a worn-out deck of cards being reshuffled and dealt again. Boredom in the military is a strange thing. It isn't a guarantee of peace. It feels more like a punishment not written into any rules of engagement. You start counting the weave squares on your body armor. You calculate how many cigarettes it takes for the moon to move 5 degrees across the sky. You mentally recite all 40 state capitals from memory and always get stuck between Montpelier and Bismarck. In that long, compressed silence, flattened by darkness, you start to believe that nothing exists beyond the camp, the red-filtered flashlights, the rifles, and the guy chewing gum next to you. Civilization retreats behind the hiss of radio static, distant and abstract. And it's precisely then that things outside that boundary begin to become noticeable. It's like staring at a wall long enough that the cracks and water stains you once ignored begin to show themselves. Except we weren't looking at a wall. We were looking at the desert north of the Waco Range, a place marked on military maps only as insignificant terrain features. And in the darkness of that desert, the surface of the world, or what we understood as a world governed by physics, rules of engagement, and daily sitreps, was thinning. I don't know how else to describe it. Years later, I read a meteorologist's journal from Svalbard, Norway, where he wrote during polar night, "When the sun doesn't rise for 40 days, you begin to hear sounds beneath the ice that shouldn't exist." I think what he experienced was the same thing I felt that night at OP-7. You think you are watching a perimeter, but in fact the perimeter is watching you. You think human perception defines the boundary of the world, but outside that boundary, something has only temporarily tolerated being defined. At 2:40 a.m., Sanchez suddenly stopped talking. Not the kind of silence that comes naturally at the end of a sentence, but a cut-off like someone had snipped a taut steel wire. I turned to him, The green glow of the night vision screen lit his face, carving his eye sockets and cheekbones into something like a medieval woodcut of a suffering saint. His right index finger pressed against the rubber eye cup, knuckles white. His mouth was slightly open, lower teeth visible, upper teeth swallowed by shadow. He wasn't breathing. No, he was breathing, but wrong. Like there was a stone in his chest and air had to flow around it. "Mike," I said. He didn't respond. I shoved his shoulder. His body armor's ceramic plate made a dull, hollow sound. He slowly turned toward me, so slowly I could see his pupils constrict in real time. I've never seen that expression on a human face. If I had to name it, I would call it cognitive emergency braking. The brain receives information that directly contradicts 20 years of experience, and so it shuts down non-essential processes, dedicating all capacity to one question. Is this a threat? But after completing that assessment, the brain refuses to pass the conclusion to conscious awareness, because the conclusion is unacceptable. "Over there," he said, just those two words. His voice dry. I leaned into the night vision scope. The N/PVS-4 showed a circular green field with a thin crosshair in the center. The desert had looked the same for hours. Low brush in pale green, rocks and sand in darker green to black as they cooled under the night sky. The moon was drifting west, casting a blurred boundary of light and shadow. I swept left to right, 11 o'clock to 1 o'clock, clear. 1 to 3, clear. 3 to I stopped. At the right edge of the scope's field of view, around the 3:30 position, roughly 250 to 300 yards out, there were two heat signatures. The first thing I noticed was height. A normal kangaroo rat shows up as just a few inches in thermal. Coyote maybe 2 feet. A standing human around 6 feet. These were at least 12 to 14 feet above the ground. My first reaction wasn't fear. It was anger, professional anger. The kind you feel when someone draws incorrect contour lines on a military map. I slapped the side of the scope, thinking it was malfunctioning again. Double imaging, ghosting. Kovac had said it was already reported for repair. I hit it 3 times. The two heat signatures didn't move. I adjusted brightness and contrast, maxed it out, then back down. The desert flickered like a curtain being pulled back and forth, but no matter what I did, they remained. They were vertical forms. No, that's not right. They were standing forms. In my report later, I used the term bipedal. But in that moment, my brain refused to accept the word. Because if they were bipedal, if they were over 12 feet tall, then I had to confront the implication. Less than 200 miles from Waco, Texas at 2:40 a.m. Two entities that did not belong to any known biological classification were standing outside our camp, silently watching us. I pulled my eyes away from the night vision scope and looked in that direction with the naked eye. Under the moonlight, the desert was empty. Nothing there at all. Only the silhouettes of sagebrush swaying gently in the wind. Then I leaned back into the scope. They were still there. Not after images. Not a malfunction. Not light refraction. They weren't just there, they were moving. One of the heat signatures was shifting slowly, almost impossibly slowly, to the left. I pushed the zoom forward. The N/PVS-4 had a maximum magnification of 4 times. At that level, the outlines of the two heat sources began to gain detail, though I shouldn't say detail, because even now, 20 years later, I still can't find any words capable of accurately describing what I saw. But I have to describe it. I made a promise to myself that night. If I survived, I would describe it. Their torsos showed the strongest thermal signatures, glowing bright white-green, indicating a core temperature significantly higher than the surrounding environment. The limbs were darker but still clearly defined. The upper limbs were too long, impossibly so. Human arms, when hanging naturally, reach about mid-thigh. These extended far below the knees when lowered. The proportions were wrong, like a silhouette stretched incorrectly. Their heads were not especially large in proportion to the body, but there was a feature that made my pupils constrict sharply. According to the thermal image, faint heat structures extended from both sides of the head. Not ears. Something else. Something like branching structures. The ends of those branches were subtly vibrating. Sanchez would later describe it as antlers twisting in heat shimmer above a fire, but that wasn't accurate. because the night vision scope wasn't showing optical distortion, it was showing heat. Those extensions were emitting heat themselves. They were part of the organism. I reached for the push-to-talk switch on the Motorola military radio hanging from my shoulder and pressed it 3 times. 2 short, 1 long. That was our patrol's emergency silent alert code, meaning unidentified anomaly detected. All units on standby. A burst of static, then Lieutenant Kovac's voice, lowered almost to a whisper, OP7, report. I brought the radio to my mouth, lips close to the grill. Sir, 330 direction, approximately 270 meters. Night vision shows 2 anomalous heat sources. Estimated height 12 to 14 feet. Bipedal. Slow movement. Request, sir. I don't know what I'm requesting. There was a silence on the line for about 5 seconds. Then Kovac said something that, at the time, sounded very strange. Do not engage. The rules of engagement during border deployment were clear and strict. If unauthorized crossing personnel were detected, fire a warning shot into the air. If they continued approaching, aim for the lower limbs. Kovac bypassed all of that. He issued a command that didn't fit any standard procedure, which meant one thing: he had seen it too. His command tent had an elevated remote thermal imaging system covering the entire perimeter. A better angle, clearer view. All units. Kovac's voice came through the radio again. I could hear him struggling to maintain a professional tone, though the end of each phrase trembled slightly. Level 1 alert. Safety switches remain on safe. Repeat. Safeties remain engaged. No one is to fire without my order. Level 1 alert meant full combat readiness. But keeping safeties engaged at the same time created a contradiction in military terms. There was only one reason a lieutenant would issue that order. He believed firing would not solve the problem. It would escalate it into something unbearable. He wasn't afraid of injuring it. He was afraid of provoking it. What happened next I will tell you in sequence, but in my memory there is no sequence. It is broken glass. No matter how you pick it up, it cuts the same place. First came the smell. It arrived before any further visual change. The wind direction was northwest-west at about 6 knots. Those things were southeast of us. Under normal conditions, we should not have smelled anything at all. But that smell wasn't carried by wind. I swear to you it wasn't. It appeared inside the nasal cavity, as if injected directly into the sinuses. The first inhale felt like a mistake. The second made me gag. It was a mixture of rotting flesh, wet feathers, and something intensely musky. The closest comparison would be a storm-damaged zoo primate enclosure drainage system backing up, but 10 times stronger. Carried a biological signature. You could tell it was not industrial waste or swamp gas. It was secretion from something alive. Sanchez pulled his cold weather mask up over his nose, but the smell went straight through the fabric as if it didn't recognize physical barriers. Then came the sound, or rather, the absence of sound. The desert night is never truly silent. There is always wind scraping sand, brush branches rubbing, distant coyotes howling. All of that stopped at once. Not gradually, instantly. It wasn't no sound. It was pressure, something invisible forcing all sound waves down into the ground. My eardrums felt compressed from both sides. I could hear my heartbeat and carotid blood flow amplified to an unsettling degree. Later I read a description in a book on deep-sea physiology. When underwater pressure reaches a certain threshold, divers experience internal noise amplification. My forehead began to tingle, not psychologically, physically, like thousands of extremely fine needles vibrating a millimeter beneath the skin. It was not imagination. It was pressure waves, low frequency, or perhaps below human hearing thresholds but above tactile perception, passing through our bodies. The thermal imaging unit in Kovac's tent was being recorded in real time onto a VHS tape by a clerk. That tape would later become something of a legend. 5 years later, at an unofficial veterans gathering at Fort Bragg, North Carolina, I met a communications technician who had been stationed at Camp McGregor. He said he had seen it. He swore the tape showed the 2 heat signatures moving from the 3:30 position toward 1 o'clock, then stopping at roughly 150 yards. And then, the upper portion of their outlines began to distort. He couldn't find the words. Expand, I asked. No. Stretch. No. Split. He was silent for a long time. Then he said, like ink dropped into water, but instead of dispersing randomly, it disperses along a pattern. I didn't ask further. His eyes told me he had already said everything he could. Around 0:30, based on my wristwatch later reconstruction, because time perception had already begun to fail, Sanchez suddenly stood up. No warning, no transition, like something had lifted him by the neck. I thought he was about to climb over the sandbags and run, so I grabbed his webbing strap. The moment my fingers locked onto his belt loop, I heard a sound from his throat. Not a scream, not a sob, not anything voluntary. It was the vibration of vocal cords pushed by airflow after fear crosses a certain threshold. He stood there, rigid, facing southeast, lips moving. I turned him toward me. His eyes were filled with tears, but his face was completely blank. Not calm, empty, as if all muscular tension had been removed. He looked at me, but he wasn't seeing me. His pupils were fully dilated in the moonlight, leaving only a thin ring of brown iris at the edges. Mike. I shook him. Mike, look at me. His lips moved. I leaned in close before I could hear what he was saying. It was Spanish. Later, I had it translated. The person who translated it was a linguistics graduate student at the University of El Paso. After I relayed the phrase to him, he closed his notebook and told me he didn't want to continue the conversation. What Sanchez said was, necesitan que los veamos. They need us to see them. Then Lieutenant Kovac's voice suddenly burst through the radio for a split second. It wasn't the controlled, restrained tone from before. It sounded like a valve had ruptured, something you can no longer close once it has opened. He said something extremely fast, drowned in static. I only caught fragments. Moving toward two-hole position. God, no, that's not walking. Those things are... The transmission cut off. Not a clean break. Not a deliberate shutdown. It was overwritten by broadband interference. Later, during electronic warfare training, I learned what that interference looked like in signal terms. Full-spectrum white noise suppression. But no known military jammer produces a continuous low-frequency pulse like that. That pulse sat somewhere around 17 to 19 hertz. In acoustics, that's infrasound. At that frequency, human eyeballs can begin to resonate. In other words, those things were physically shaking our eyes at that distance. That's why Sanchez's pupils dilated the way they did. It wasn't fear. It was resonance. The first scream hit us while I was already dragging Sanchez back toward the camp perimeter. It came from no more than 80 yards away. It wasn't produced by a throat, or at least not by any small vocal cavity. It was pressure. A wall of sound forming in midair and moving. A sharp pain shot through my left eardrum, followed by a constant high-pitched tone. Then my left ear simply stopped working. Not went quiet. It cut out completely, like a channel fader being slammed to zero. For the next 72 hours, that ear heard nothing. But the most disturbing thing about that scream wasn't its volume. It was its texture. It was layered. That's the only precise way to describe it. Later, I found the word polyphonic. A human vocal system can produce one fundamental frequency at a time plus harmonics. That scream contained at least 3 independent fundamentals. One high-frequency component like tearing metal, one mid-range component like a large feline growl, and one extremely low frequency almost below auditory perception but felt directly in the ribcage. They did not alternate. They did not harmonize. They existed simultaneously, independent, incompatible, and stacked together, as if 3 different sound sources were being forced through a single outlet. No, as if 3 throats were sharing one exit. Sanchez jolted as if he had been slapped out of deep hypnosis. The emptiness in his eyes vanished, replaced by pure, unfiltered terror, but he was coherent again. He looked at me, blood already smeared across his bitten lips. Go, he said. We began to fall back. Not running. Running in that terrain, in that layout, would mean twisted ankles or worse. Instead, we used CQB-trained tactical withdrawal. Heel-to-toe movement, upper body always oriented toward the threat, M16 shouldered, safety off but finger indexed near the selector. 1 step, 2, 3. With every step back, the heat signature in the night vision scope grew larger. Not because it was advancing, but because it was becoming closer in a way that didn't correspond to physical movement. That's the only way I can phrase it. It wasn't crossing space. It was adjusting how it occupied space relative to us. Its thermal outline kept changing, limbs dissolving into the torso, then reforming elsewhere, as if it were continuously testing which configuration made sense at that distance. On the 4th step, I saw Lieutenant Kovac burst out of the command tent. He wasn't carrying a rifle. He was holding a portable spotlight wrapped in tape. He slammed it onto a sandbag and shouted something. Left ear still dead, right ear only catching fragments. Then he ripped off the lens cover and flipped it on. A column of white-blue light tore through the darkness, and in that light I saw it. Roughly 40 yards away, not 12 feet tall, closer to 15. It stood on 2 hind limbs. I use the word hind limbs because the moment I saw it, my brain refused to accept the word legs. The joint structure didn't match anything in terrestrial biology. If those were knees, they bent backward. Digitigrade structure closer to birds or theropod dinosaurs, but with 3 toes instead of 4 or 5. The forelimbs were even longer than what the night vision had shown. At the ends were not hands, not claws, but 3 symmetrical, keratin-like extensions, glistening wetly under the spotlight. Then the head. I finally saw the branching structures clearly. Not vague thermal artifacts anymore, real anatomy under high-intensity light. They were moving. Each branch flexed independently, rotating slightly, covered in microscopic slit-like openings that rhythmically expanded and contracted. From those openings, a heat-like vapor was being expelled in controlled pulses. The vapor hit the cold night air and instantly condensed into mist, then vanished. That was the source of the faint thermal signatures in the night vision. Those weren't appendages. They were conduits, not organs in the traditional sense. A distributed respiratory interface with the environment. It was breathing, but not through mouth or nose. It was breathing through those branching structures. Its entire upper torso was a massive, 3-dimensional respiratory system made of articulated keratin. The spotlight stayed on it for about 2.5 seconds. Then it turned toward the light, and in that moment, Kovac did something I had never seen in uniform. He dropped the spotlight, covered his head, and buried his face in the sand. The thing emitted a second sound. No scream this time, no overwhelming acoustic impact. It was low, wet, like wood being slowly crushed underwater, mixed with airflow through a confined space. But at the exact moment that sound reached us, the sand beneath our boots began to move. Not metaphorically. Each grain vibrated in place at high frequency. The entire ground surface became a trembling membrane. The vibration traveled through my boots into my skeleton. Not shaking. More like every vertebra was being gently tapped by an invisible finger. Sanchez's nose started bleeding. 2 dark streams ran from his nostrils, across his lips, meeting at his chin. He didn't notice. My own sinuses burned sharply, like inhaling concentrated ammonia, but there was no ammonia in the air. It was vascular resonance failure in the sinus lining caused by infrasound. Kovac lay face down, his back rising and falling violently. Ocampo, the clerk, a small Mexican-American from San Antonio with round glasses and an unnaturally soft voice, stumbled out of the tent holding the recording camera. He made it 5 steps. Then his knees simply gave out. Not a trip, a structural failure. Later, the medic would attribute it to micro-tearing of the ACL under sustained low-frequency vibration stress. The camera flew from his hands, hit a rock, the back popped open, and the Vichas tape rolled out. Stopped near my boots. I looked down. A TDK HS 120-minute cassette. The label read, in black marker, 10-19. 0230 OP7 tape 1-inch. I remember that line to this day. Sanchez's lips were moving. I leaned in close before I could make out what he was saying. It was Spanish. Later, I had it translated. The translator was a linguistics graduate student at the University of El Paso. After I relayed the phrase, He closed his notebook and told me he didn't want to continue the conversation. What Sánchez Edwes? Necesitan que los veamos. They need us to see them. Then Lieutenant Kovac's voice suddenly erupted through the radio for a fraction of a second. It was nothing like the controlled tone from before. It sounded like a valve that had blown open, something that can't be closed again. He was speaking extremely fast, buried in static. I only caught fragments. Moving toward two-hole direction. God, no, that's not. How they move, they're not walking. The transmission cut off. Not a clean break. Not a deliberate shutdown. It was overwritten by broadband interference. Later, in electronic warfare training, I learned what that kind of interference looked like, full-spectrum white noise suppression. But no known military system produces a sustained low-frequency pulse like that. That pulse sat around 17 to 19 hertz. In acoustics, that's infrasound. At that frequency, human eyeballs can physically resonate. In other words, those things were shaking our eyes. That's why Sanchez's pupils had dilated like that. Not fear, resonance. The first scream reached us while I was trying to pull Sanchez back toward the camp. It came from no more than 80 yards away. It didn't originate from a throat, or at least not any throat meant for human-scale anatomy. It was pressure, a moving wall of sound. My left eardrum flared with pain, then a constant high-pitched ringing. After that, my left ear simply stopped working. Not muffled, gone, like a channel cut to zero. It stayed deaf for 72 hours. But the worst thing about that scream wasn't its volume. It was its structure. It was layered. That's the only accurate term. Later, I learned the word polyphonic. A human voice can produce one fundamental frequency plus harmonics. That scream contained at least 3 independent fundamentals. One high frequency like tearing metal, one mid-range like a large predator's growl, and one extremely low frequency that wasn't heard so much as felt in the ribs. They didn't alternate. They didn't harmonize. They coexisted, simultaneous, incompatible, stacked, as if 3 separate sound sources were being forced through one outlet. No, as if 3 throats shared a single exit. Sanchez jolted as if pulled out of deep hypnosis. The emptiness in his eyes vanished, replaced by pure, distilled fear. But he was back. He looked at me, blood smeared across his bitten lips. Go, he said. We began to withdraw, not running. Running would have meant twisted ankles or worse in that terrain. Instead, we used CQB tactical movement, heel to toe, upper body always facing the threat, M16 shouldered, safety off but finger indexed. 1 step, 2, 3. With each step back, the heat signature in the night vision grew larger. Not because it was advancing, but because it was changing how it existed relative to us. That's the only way I can say it. It wasn't moving through space. It was reconfiguring space around itself. Its thermal outline kept shifting, limbs dissolving into torso, then reappearing elsewhere, as if it were testing what form made sense at that distance. On the 4th step, Lieutenant Kovac ran out of the command tent. He wasn't carrying a rifle. He had a portable spotlight wrapped in tape. He slammed it onto a sandbag and shouted something. My left ear still dead, right ear catching only fragments. Then he tore off the lens cover and switched it on. A column of white-blue light cut through the darkness, and I saw it. About 40 yards away, not 12 feet tall, closer to 15, standing on hind limbs. I use hind limbs because the moment I saw it, my brain refused the word legs. The joint structure didn't match any known terrestrial anatomy. If those were knees, they bent the wrong way. Digitigrade structure, bird-like, theropod-like, but with 3 toes. The forelimbs were longer than what the night vision had shown. At their ends were not hands or claws, but 3 symmetrical keratin structures, wet and glossy under the light, dark green-gray like varnished bone. Then the head. The branching structures were no longer ambiguous. They were real. Each one moved independently, flexing and rotating. Their surfaces were covered in microscopic slit-like openings that rhythmically opened and closed. From them came pulses of vapor, hot, structured emissions. The vapor hit cold night air and condensed instantly into mist before dissolving. That was the thermal signature we saw earlier. Those weren't appendages. They were interfaces, a distributed respiratory system extending into the environment. It wasn't breathing through mouth or nose. It was breathing through those branches. Its entire upper torso was a three-dimensional respiratory architecture made of articulated keratin. The spotlight stayed on it for about 2.5 seconds. Then it turned toward the light, and in that moment, Kovac did something I had never seen a soldier do. He dropped the spotlight, covered his head, and pressed his face into the sand. It emitted a second sound. Not a scream, not a blast. Low, wet, like wood being compressed underwater, mixed with forced airflow. But at the exact moment it sounded, the ground beneath us began to move. Not metaphorically. Each grain of sand vibrated in place at high frequency. The entire surface became a trembling membrane. The vibration traveled through my boots into my spine, not shaking, tapping, each vertebra, one by one, as if touched by an invisible finger. Sanchez began to bleed from his nose. 2 dark streams ran down his face. He didn't notice. My own sinuses burned like ammonia exposure, but there was no ammonia. It was infrasound-induced vascular resonance failure. Kovac lay face down, shoulders shaking violently. Ocampo, the clerk from San Antonio, small, glasses, soft voice, stumbled out of the tent holding the camera. He made it 5 steps. Then his knees collapsed. Not a trip, a structural failure. Later, medics would call it micro-tearing of the ACL under sustained low-frequency vibration stress. The camera flew, hit a rock, the back popped open, and the VHS tape rolled out. Stopped at my boots. I looked down. A TDK HS 120-minute cassette. The label read 10, 19, 0230 OP7 tape 1-inch. I remember that line exactly. He raised one finger, signaling me not to ask. Later, I learned what Kovac had measured with the map ruler. The line formed by the final positions of the 2 entities, when extended southwest, terminated in the northern sector of the White Sands Missile Range in New Mexico, an area labeled on public maps as a long-term environmental monitoring station. On all active military maps, that zone was coded L9. Not Area 51, not Dugway, not China Lake. L9. A designation I spent the next 5 years unable to find in any public record, any veteran account, or any indexed classified document. It was as if it had never existed, or had been carefully erased, line by line, from everything that recorded it. Before 4 a.m., the fog rolled in. Fog almost never forms in the desert north of the Waco Range in October. The humidity here stays below 15% year-round. The meteorological conditions simply don't allow it. And yet it formed, not drifting in from the horizon, but rising from the ground itself, as if the earth had suddenly begun exhaling. The texture was wrong. Normal radiative fog should scatter light uniformly under red-lensed lamps. This fog didn't. Under flashlight beams it showed a fibrous structure, like extremely diluted cotton candy stretched into strands, and each strand moved, slowly, deliberately. If a fog's particles are not undergoing random Brownian motion, but instead exhibit coordinated directional rotation, then it is no longer weather in any meaningful sense. Sanchez was the first to pull his M17 gas mask from his kit and put it on. Then another soldier, then Kovac, then all of us. When the rubber seal pressed against my face, I smelled charcoal and talc powder, the interior residue of the mask, the smell of human industrial systems, the smell of something still governed by physics we understood. Through the dual polycarbonate lenses, the fog outside looked even less real. It clung to the outer surface of the visor, not condensing into droplets, but forming a thin, iridescent film. At 4:11, the radio came alive again. Same flat voice. OP7, blue status is lifted. Evacuation window is open. Proceed immediately south along designated route to Camp McGregor Main Base. All personnel will undergo medical evaluation upon arrival. All night vision and thermal recording equipment and storage media are to be surrendered to Brigade Intelligence. All personnel are prohibited from recording, discussing, or transmitting any aspect of tonight's observations. This directive is issued under United States Code. Kovac reached over and turned the volume knob down. That single motion made the hair on my neck stand up. Not because of what was outside, not because of the fog, but because a U.S. Army lieutenant had just chosen to reduce the volume of a lawful order. It meant he was deciding how much of it we were allowed to hear, because hearing it too clearly meant you could not later claim ignorance.
We departed OP7 at 04:47.
No sunrise yet, only the faint shift of the eastern horizon from black into an extremely deep blue-gray. The fog began to dissipate as soon as the engines of the Humvees started. In less than 4 minutes, it went from dense white opacity to nothing at all. The ground was dry, no moisture, no residue, as if it had never happened. We drove south along the crushed gravel route. I sat in the rear of the third vehicle, M16 upright between my knees. Sanchez stared at his hands, flexing and unflexing his fingers as if verifying they still belonged to him. Ocampo lay on a stretcher, still under morphine, breathing slow and deep. Outside the window, the Waco Range emerged in the morning light, ordinary, ancient, eroded, silent in the way mountains always are, as if nothing had ever occurred there at all. What happened after we returned to Camp McGregor was more revealing than the night itself. We were separated into different medical tents. Military police stood at each entrance. Not regular MPs. Full white helmets. MP armbands. My medical evaluation lasted 4.5 hours. 3 different medical teams entered, each repeating identical questions. Name, rank, ID number, timeline, weather conditions, alcohol or drug use, target size, shape, movement patterns. Everything was recorded on tape and written simultaneously. But in the third session, a field physician brought in a portable X-ray unit and scanned my entire head and neck. He said it was to check for structural cranial damage from infrasound exposure. During the scan, my uniform and body armor were confiscated for environmental residue analysis. They were never returned. Instead, I was given a brand new set of fatigues with no unit patch and no name tape. What was being removed was not just evidence of the event, but physical proof that we had ever been in contact with it. That afternoon, a SH-47 Chinook arrived from Fort Hood. The passengers were not medics or reinforcements. They were civilians in dark blue coveralls, no rank insignia. The leader was a gray-haired woman wearing gold-rimmed glasses, carrying a locked aluminum briefcase. She met with the base commander for 20 minutes. Then she came directly to us. She placed a document in front of me. I read the first page. It stated that I acknowledged under law that during my October 19, 1987 night watch, I had misreported a non-existent threat due to extreme fatigue and desert optical hallucination, that I agreed to 2 weeks of psychological evaluation, and that I would not discuss the event with any third party. In exchange, medical costs would be covered and the incident would not appear in my service record. I pushed it back. She showed no reaction, simply closed the case, stood up and said, "You have 1 hour. You do not leave this base unless this document is resolved." An hour later, I was brought back. Kovac was already there. His eyes were red, not from tears, but from ruptured capillaries under exhaustion and pressure. He had already signed. I signed too. That night, I left Camp McGregor in a transport truck with Sanchez and Ocampo. No one spoke. The tires rolled over gravel. The headlights carved a narrow corridor through the vast darkness of West Texas. Everything else remained submerged in it. This March, a classified internal memo dated November 1987 briefly appeared during a closed congressional hearing on unacknowledged aerial and transmedium phenomena. The public feed was cut the moment the document appeared. But in that fraction of a second, someone in the back row captured a single frame and later sent it to an independent researcher. The image was low resolution, most text blurred, but the header was legible. Department of Defense Interagency Coordination Office to Army Intelligence and Security Command. The first line of the body, enhanced and sharpened, read, "Regarding the October 19th encounter at OP7 McGregor Camp, The assessment of the prior existence of these entities within L9 corridor remains classified at the highest tier, L9. 20 years later, the coordinate I had drawn on a map with a pencil, the one that formed a blunt triangle, had reappeared in a document from which it had supposedly been erased. I don't know what was written after that memo. I don't know what those two things were. Standing less than 40 yards from me in the desert north of the Waco Range on the night of October 19, 1987. I don't know how many nights in the past 20 years, how many remote outposts, how many pairs of eyes behind night vision scopes picked up similar thermal signatures, only for those readings, along with the observer's memories, to be sealed into locked aluminum briefcases and buried in archive rooms no light could reach. I don't know what was on the cut segments of that congressional hearing footage. The only thing I do know is this: the flat, emotionless voice that came through Kovacs radio that night, and the vast, silent, tireless machinery of classification it represented, has spent the last 20 years doing one thing: not denying that those things exist, but ensuring that everyone who saw them would never again be able to turn what they saw into language another human being could believe. Sanchez took his own life 3 years after discharge, in his home in El Paso with a handgun. Ocampo survived. 2 reconstructive surgeries on his knee allowed him to leave the service on medical grounds. He returned to San Antonio and opened a small auto repair shop. In 2004, he sent me a Christmas card. Inside was a photograph of the asphalt road in front of his shop, cracked by the Texas summer heat. On the back, he wrote one line: "The ground here never shakes." Kovac was later reassigned to the 8th Army in Korea as head of a logistics warehouse far from the front lines. We spoke once on the phone, around 1991. He told me he had rented a small apartment on a hill north of Seoul, overlooking the Imjin River. He said he wasn't particularly interested in the river, but he liked watching the white herons that circled above it. The moment they landed, when their legs hung suspended just above the surface of the water, reminded him of something. Then he said he should hang up. I waited. He didn't. There was a long silence. Then he said, "I never wrote down the coordinates I measured that night, but I know the number. I repeat it to myself every night before sleep. I can't forget it, because if I do, then it means none of it ever happened." Static filled the line. Then he hung up. In high magnification night vision, thermal shapes are always soft-edged, diffuse, imprecise. That is a limitation of the physics of thermal imaging. But what I saw through the N/PVS for that night was different. Their edges were sharp, not because of the device, because they were actively separating themselves from the surrounding thermal environment. They were hot. In a desert winter night that dropped below freezing, they radiated heat like ancient lava left exposed on the surface. Continuous, unexplained, requiring no fuel source. And at some point, they decided we would no longer see them. Not disappearance. Cessation of being observed. The difference between those two things is the distance between human perception and everything beyond it. I have a granddaughter. She is 9 years old. Last month, she asked me where people go when they die. I told her I didn't know. Then she asked where we come from when we are alive. I told her that was a very large question, and I couldn't answer it. She blinked. Then she asked the question I still have not answered. She said, "What was here before humans?" Before humans. Before border patrol units and rear area reconnaissance and rules of engagement and SITREPs. Before Camp McGregor and OP7 and the N/PVS-4. Before the Department of Defense coordination offices and the highest tiers of classification. Before L9 was labeled anything at all. Before it was ocean or forest or ice or anything we would recognize. What was here? The VHS tape that rolled to my boots. Brown casing. TDK HS 120 minutes. Label 10.
190230 op 7 tape 1.
I never told the interrogators about it. It never appeared in any file. Officially, it was described as destroyed during the incident. In reality, I smuggled it out in the inner lining of my fatigues the day I left Camp McGregor. Later, I brought it home. I never played it. For 20 years, I kept it in an ammo box in the attic, sealed in 3 layers of moisture-proof bags. I could not find a machine to play it, and I never really tried. Do you know why? Because once you have confirmed something like that with your own eyes, you can never again pretend the world is what you were told it was. And what I fear is not confirming its existence. What I fear is that the moment the tape is placed into a player and the screen lights up, I will see those two heat signatures in the grain of analog noise, turning toward me across 20 years of silence, erased coordinates, signed affidavits, and all the people who could not carry the memory forward, and through all of it, they will make a third sound. And I will understand it.